Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. As always, it's your one-stop shop to take stock of all the progress on the political and literal battlefields. Now let's go ahead and get started with some of the most important stories coming straight out of Ukraine. Russia has ramped up its attacks on Ukraine, launching missile and drone attacks. Moscow's troops have been hitting power generation and civilian targets. As winter begins to bite across the country, many communities are facing power cuts.
Police inspect an explosion crater in Kyiv. The attack here injured at least 23 people and damaged over 40 buildings. The Air Force said of the 145 drones used in the assault, Ukraine shot down 71 and lost track of 71 more, likely due to electronic warfare measures used against them. This was followed a day later by a record attack with 188 Shahed and other drones used against Ukraine. Here in Sumy, Russian shelling killed 2 civilians. Emergency services released footage showing its workers hosing down a fire and digging through rubble in a search for survivors. Emergency teams in Odessa rescued people inside a residential building in the aftermath of a strike on the city centre that left 11 injured. Officials said the Kremlin's key target was the country's power infrastructure. Kyiv was plunged into darkness as Russian attacks on the energy system triggered deep power cuts across the country. Now power workers are battling to repair damaged generators, transmission stations and cables in a desperate bid to keep the lights on. Millions are facing energy shortages. In Lviv, the attacks left more than 500,000 without electricity. On-street generators, their only reliable source of power.
The United States this week confirmed that Kyiv used American long-range missiles on targets in Russia. The disclosure was made during a press briefing.
These are said to be images showing a US Army tactical missile system known as ATACMS being launched at targets in Russia. It came after President Joe Biden backed the move. The White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby confirmed their use to reporters during a midweek briefing. They are able to use ATACMS to defend themselves in an immediate need basis. And right now, understandably, that's taking place in and around Kursk, in the Kursk Oblast. We did change the guidance and gave them guidance that they could use them to strike these particular types of targets. President Wladimir Zelensky later said Ukraine was using ATACMS, which have a range of up to 300 kilometers. Experts say the move will boost Ukraine's defense capability and place Kyiv in a better negotiating position.
A Ukrainian member of parliament, Alexander Merezhko, has reportedly put U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's name forward for next year's Nobel Peace Prize. The Kyiv Independent writes that it has read the submission letter.
Donald Trump's re-election as US president has raised question marks in Europe over transatlantic relations, future support for NATO, and continued American backing for Ukraine in its war with Russia. President Volodymyr Zelensky has praised Trump as a strong leader and urged him not to abandon Ukraine in pursuit of a quick-fix peace with Russia. But while some in Ukraine have raised concerns over Trump's praise for his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin, one Ukrainian MP, Alexander Merezhko, has reportedly nominated Trump for the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize. Merezhko, who is a member of Zelensky's Servant of the People party, says in a letter to the prize committee seen by the Kyiv Independent that he believes Trump could bring about a just, comprehensive and sustainable peace. There was no comment from the Nobel Peace Prize Committee regarding the reported submission.
At a summit of Poland, Nordic and Baltic states, the Prime Minister said that they would step up support for Ukraine in the coming months. The leader said that they plan to boost the country's defense industry and invest in making more ammunition.
Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk is welcomed by his Swedish counterpart Ulf Kristersson at his official country residence.
Welcome to the countryside.
The two-day summit of the so-called Nordic-Baltic 8 and Poland at Harpsund west of Stockholm covered transatlantic relations, regional security cooperation and the war in Ukraine. Aid from the Nordics, Baltics and Poland totals around 24 billion euros, according to the Kiel Institute's Ukraine Support Tracker, second only to the United States in absolute terms. The summit agreed to boost support for Ukraine's defence industry and invest in making more ammunition available. In a joint statement, the leaders also said they were committed to strengthening deterrence and defence against conventional as well as hybrid attacks and to expanding sanctions against Russia.
Ukraine's defense chief, Rustem Umerov, has revealed that the international drone coalition will set aside a total of 1.8 billion euro by the end of the year for a range of defense projects.
The use of drones has been key to Ukraine's defense, with their ability to mount precise attacks behind Russian lines. Recognition of the vital role unmanned aerial vehicles play spurred the UK and Latvia to earlier this year launch a major drone capability coalition for Ukraine. Ukraine's defense minister, Rustem Umerov, revealed on Facebook that the 17 member countries plan to allocate 1.8 billion euros to the project by the end of 2024. This decision will allow Ukraine to strengthen the technological advantage on the battlefield and destroy the enemy more effectively. The coalition plans to deliver 1 million first-person view drones to Kyiv. The group is also working to provide reconnaissance UAVs, strike drones, AI-upgraded drones and counter-drone capabilities.
And now it's time to take a look at the war in Ukraine through the lens of a journalist. We have ambitious Ukrainian long-range strikes that hit Russian air defenses, a refinery, and naval base. Now let's welcome Oz Chatterjee to the program. Hello, Oz. Thanks for joining us. Can you fill us in on the details of these ambitious attacks by Ukraine?
Well, this is part of a long-standing campaign that Ukraine has been using while it has been seeking the permission to use American-supplied or British-supplied long-range weapon systems or medium-range weapon systems, they should be more accurately referred to as. Ukraine has developed its own domestic drone program, which it has used to some effect, targeting oil refineries deep inside Russia, but also air bases. And this week, they were reported to have hit by local authorities, occupational authorities in Crimea, hit the Bebek, explosions reported near the Bebek airfield near Sevastopol. So attacks happening in Crimea, deep inside Russia, using weapons that Ukraine have effectively manufactured themselves. Maybe they've taken some inspiration from the Shahed Iranian drone systems that they've been fighting off since Russia started using them here in Ukraine. But they are domestically supplied, domestically manufactured drone systems that they've been using to some devastating effect in Russia's backline.
This shows us the domestically produced weapons are really picking up and are desperately needed there to conduct these strikes. Now, another thing that hit our desk is North Korea has given Russia more than 100 ballistic missiles, 5 million artillery shells. This is according to Ukrainian authorities.
Yes, this was on Friday. They reported that they were, the GUR, Ukraine's military intelligence, reported that the North Koreans had supplied 5 million artillery shells and more than 100 short-range ballistic missiles. But also they've supplied more than 100 pieces of heavy equipment, including self-propelled artillery and multiple launch rocket systems. Now, this is going to be a big concern for Kyiv because Russia's been burning through these kinds of systems at a massive rate in its offensives in the east, and it hasn't had anywhere else to replenish that stock other than its own manufacturing base. So being able to dip into North Korean stocks will be of grave concern to Kyiv because they are unable to replenish those stocks themselves unless their allies donate more equipment to them.
And one last question. I mean, we saw these preliminary reports that indicated that North Koreans could be in the Kharkiv region. Is there any new information on that front?
We're yet to see concrete, solid evidence of them inside Ukraine. There have been some very credible reports that one of the long-range attacks that Ukraine did with its storm shadows may have killed some North Koreans, including North Korean officers. But again, trying to get firm, concrete, visual evidence of these kinds of things is difficult in the Russian backline, at least. So if they start making it to the front lines, the Ukrainian authorities will definitely want to present that evidence to the international community. So at the moment, we await to see visual evidence of that. But the Ukrainian authorities are taking this very, very seriously, as are the Americans, as are many of the other Western allies who think this is a very real occurrence that could be happening on the Ukrainian battlefields very, very soon, if not already taking place in the Kursk region.
All right, Oz Chatterjee reporting for us from Kyiv. Thank you, and keep yourself safe. The future shape of the relations between Washington and Kyiv gained some clarity this week with the nomination of Joseph Keith Kellogg as President-elect Donald Trump's special envoy for the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The retired lieutenant general has already presented Trump with a plan to end the war.
Donald Trump shakes hands with Keith Kellogg after he was named Chief of Staff to the National Security Council during the President-elect's first term in office in 2017. Now the retired Lieutenant General has been tapped by Trump as his representative for Ukraine and Russia. Seen here addressing the Republican National Convention during the 2020 campaign, he's widely regarded as a Trump loyalist. Quickly ending the war in Ukraine was one of Trump's central campaign promises. He's so far, though, revealed little about how he would achieve this. Kellogg, who has already presented a plan to Trump, will be key to this. Keith has led a distinguished military and business career, including serving in highly sensitive national security roles in my first administration. He was with me right from the beginning. Together, we will secure peace through strength. Reuters reported that Kellogg's plan involves forcing Ukraine and Russia to the negotiating table after freezing the current front lines. Under the proposal, Kyiv would only get more US weapons and munitions if it sat down for talks. Moscow would be warned that if it refused to take part, American backing for Kyiv would increase. Ukrainian membership of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization would be removed from the agenda for the near future. While fixing the front line would end nearly 3 years of intense war, it would give Russia control over parts of eastern Ukraine.
And now joining me to dig deeper in this new pick for the next Trump administration is Mark Toth, national security expert, and Anders Aslund, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Gentlemen, hello to you both, and thank you very much for joining us here on Ukraine This Week.
Thank you.
Now, starting with this pick, General Kellogg, Keith Kellogg, well, I can't seem to really figure out what his exact position is going to be. If we look at this, this peace plan that he put together over the summer, it seems to be very strict on Ukraine and actually leads us to believe that perhaps Ukraine could be thrown under the bus with such an envoy. But at the same time, if we look at past statements by General Kellogg going back to 2023, he was touting all the same lines of anybody who supports Ukraine. So starting with you, Professor, would you like to, what are your thoughts on this latest pick?
Well, first of all, General Kellogg is not the worst person. It was a fear that it would be somebody who really wanted to go against Ukraine, like Vice President J.D. Vance or former Ambassador Rick Grenell. And so it's a relief they were not there. And as you suggested, General Kellogg has been all over the map. The only thing that he is not in favor of is doing the Biden policy. So he has both said that the US should do less and that the US should do more. Specifically has been in favor of using US long-range missiles attacking Russian goals. And he has sounded most recently, for example, in a Fox News interview, that he thinks that President Trump should escalate in order to get Putin to the negotiation table. So you can say that he's pretty open-minded, and that's not a bad thing.
Certainly. Now, Mark, what are your thoughts on General Kellogg?
Yeah, no, I concur with Professor Aslan's assessment here. I think there could have been worse appointments. I think it's also important to remember that General Kellogg is the envoy, not necessarily the policymaker. And I think it's a little bit difficult this many months past, 7 months now, since he penned that piece along with Brett Fleets, basically outlining how he would affect a peace deal in Ukraine, to determine or fast forward, if you will, how applicable that is of today. I think there could be some strategic ambiguity as well that's coming out of his negotiating position in terms of past statements that would have been strongly supportive. Now, granted, is a critic most likely of the Biden administration. He was arguing that more should have done before Russia invaded Ukraine, and more should have been done after Russia invaded Ukraine in terms of supplying them with heavy weapons, authorizations for deep precision strikes inside of Russia if need be, and obviously upping the artillery and mortar-bound production here in the U.S. Now, subsequently, though, he's backed off some of that in more recent statements, basically saying that the U.S. only has certain limits, given that it's facing a conflict potentially in China, and that it's left the U.S. depleted. So I think he's, kind of trying to create this ambiguity at this point in time, and we just won't know until they take office and until we see this overall policy, if you will, that's going to be formulated by Mike Waltz as his national security advisor, as well as John Ratcliffe at CIA, as well as Marco Rubio to a lesser extent at the State Department. Until they get together and we see what they're presenting, we're not going to exactly know. But, in terms of the plan itself, I'd remind people that even in the plan, as you read that, the one that was articulated last April, they were even doubtful that they could get Putin to agree to this. I mean, while it certainly would be shocking for Ukraine if they had to cede territory, if they had to freeze the battle lines along the current front, there's a lot of things here that I don't think Putin is going to be willing to accept, and he certainly won't accept them in the long term.
Right, and actually that you hit the point right on the head there. This freezing of the current lines where they lay. We've also seen information released from the Kremlin that says they want to break Ukraine into three kind of zones, if you will. One that's Western Ukraine that kind of gets to be a little bit more free, but the other two, central Ukraine and the east, essentially controlled by the Kremlin. So if that's their strategy, then one would think that you couldn't freeze the current battle, the current front lines at that space. However, we've also talked about this for months, gentlemen, that what about the dangers of freezing the conflict right now? How much of an advantage would that provide to Moscow? And what would that do for the Ukrainian war effort? And Professor, I'll pose that question to you.
Well, from the beginning, with his article on the 12th of July 2021, President Putin has been clear he does not accept Ukraine as existence. He has also already annexed large territories of Ukraine, Zaporozhye Oblast and Kherson Oblast, that he does not control, where he does not control the main cities. So for Putin, it's impossible to stop now, given what he has said before. So Putin cannot really accept to freeze the battle lines as they go now.
And Mark, another notable, something we can observe by the currently occupied territories is that Russia holds no major Ukrainian city within those areas. So is this going to be unacceptable for Vladimir Putin to even sit down at the table? And what will this do to these negotiations? Is this dead on arrival?
Yeah, it's more than a fair question. And I think you've got to look at Putin with a multifaceted view going on here. To the extent that he's willing to negotiate now, in my opinion, it's simply to buy time. He's got his hands full. I can concur completely with Professor Haslund that he's not going to stop or be satisfied with where he's at this point in time in Ukraine. He wants it all. And is not going to accept it over time, in terms of, as you point out, Don, no major cities, et cetera, just what he's gained in the Donbass and being able, by the, chin of his teeth there, been able to hold on to Crimea. He's got a lot of things happening. He's having to rely on North Korea, just as you were reporting earlier in this segment, that he's importing 100 ballistic missiles, another 5 million artillery rounds from North Korea, still continuing on economic support from China, as well as dual-use technologies that are being imported into Russia for military purposes. And then even today, not to get too far down this Mideast path, you even see what's going on with rebels. Now, granted, these are ISIS and former al-Qaeda fighters, but even these rebels that have now taken the center of Aleppo in Syria is creating another dilemma for Putin and his forces, along with the Syrian and Iranian-backed IRGC troops, have now fled south. So, to the extent that Putin's willing to pause and negotiate, quote unquote, if you will, negotiate, it's just to buy time, and I don't think any of us should be fooled by that.
Right. Now, Professor, since we've had you on the show last time, the Russian economy has slipped even further. Some would say it's in a free fall as far as the currency is concerned. The rates are, interest rates are through the roof, and inflation, especially food inflation, has also been notably very, very high. So would freezing the conflict give Vladimir Putin some respite, some relief as far as his economic woes are concerned? Wouldn't it be in his interest to freeze the conflict?
Yes, he wants a certain ceasefire, but he does not want negotiations. I think that's pretty much as we can sum it up, what Mr. Toth just said. And the economic situation is now finally quite critical. So the inflation is officially 9%, and the interest rate is 21%. And the Russian industrialists are now crying murder and saying that our factories will bankrupt with these very high real interest rates, which are then commercially 27 to 30%. So this is not tenable, and the ruble has fallen in the last 2 weeks from 96 rubles per dollar to 113 rubles per dollar yesterday. This is not tenable. It might be a certain recovery because of a very high interest rates, but clearly we are now seeing a massive capital flight from Russia. Inflation is rising, the ruble is falling. The Russians are not easily moved, but this is a bad situation for the Russian people.
Indeed. Now, Mark, North Korean soldiers, as you mentioned, how is Washington going to, let's say, respond to this when Donald Trump comes into office? We all remember the famous sit-down that he had with Kim Jong-un. There's been lots of jokes on the internet that Donald Trump has a new rocket man in the name of course, Elon Musk. But really, how should U.S. address this problem that, we see the huge numbers of weapons that North Korea is sending to the front lines, as well as soldiers? What should the U.S. do about this, and how can they fix this situation?
Yeah, Don, great question. As my writing partner, Colonel John Sweet, and I have argued frequently, is that we do believe this is a global war, not Hollywood's version, not mushroom clouds, not day after radioactive scenarios. But when you look at, the participation levels of Iran, the Shahed drones that have been pummeling Ukraine, when you look at what North Korea is doing in terms of introducing troops, munitions, et cetera, onto the battlefields, at least at this point in Kursk, if not eventually in the Donbass itself, it's global. And it's been interesting in this period. And again, as you know, I'm apolitical. Don't take sides here. I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. It's been interesting that for the most part, North Korean participation has been met with silence, arguably, in Washington, and not enough made of it. Now, in terms of how Trump will handle that, time will tell. He's either going to, play to his ego, which he does frequently, and thinks he can solve it, or he's going to have to come to terms, which is what I'm hopeful of. Again, not suggesting he will, just what I'm hopeful of. He's going to have to come to terms with that Putin has truly turned this into a global conflict, and that he can't take this, lightly, and that this is something that's upped the game, that's changed the equations. It not only affects Ukraine and Russia, but it also affects what's going on in the Korean Peninsula. And so there's a lot broader thing at stake here. So again, I'm hopeful that Trump will get that, but time will tell. Again, this is a man who tends to negotiate based on his ego, not in terms of the reality of the situation around him or the intelligence that he's getting from the community. And just a quick note, once again, I believe it was just yesterday on social media, he was out saying basically, look, the only reason that he didn't get into a war is because he was smart and didn't trust his intelligence guys and the generals around him, which in my opinion, if he takes that into office, it's going to be a huge mistake. He needs to be listening.
Certainly. Well, I want to go back to this plan of General Kellogg. Another issue here would be territory, trading territory. And I'd like to ask you, Professor, what precedent would this set if we even contemplated redrawing borders in eastern Ukraine?
Well, this would be very serious indeed. And you can say that there are three aspects to it. The first is what happens to international law. This would be completely against the UN Charter and all the OSCE agreements, Helsinki from 1975, etc., etc. So that would be one serious part. The other is that Ukraine has a lot of valuable raw materials in the occupied territories in Donbass. And the third thing, which is most important practically for the Ukrainian economy, that is Crimea has to be Ukrainian in order to safeguard commercial shipping over the Black Sea. Right now, Ukraine can just about ship raw materials over the Black Sea. 90% of what Ukraine exports is raw materials. Agricultural goods and iron ore, steel and steel pipes. And you have to make sure that this shipping goes, because it cannot be transported over railway. It costs too much. So security of shipping over the Black Sea is vital for Ukraine. And for that, Ukraine actually needs Crimea. So the idea that Crimea should be Russian is very flawed from the point of Ukrainian national and economic security.
And Mark, of course, talking about these natural resources in eastern Ukraine, President Wladimir Zelensky was very adamant about offering this, putting this on the table, I guess, let's put it that way, to try and entice Donald Trump to get his support. Donald Trump is a very transactional person. Is this a good strategy for Volodymyr Zelensky to employ, saying, listen, we will welcome American companies to come in and share in this boom?
Right. Yeah. Let me first say, Don, if I can, Professor Öcalan put that brilliantly in terms of that argument. There's no way that Putin should be allowed to get 1 inch through aggression of Ukrainian territory. I'd only add, and again, what he said was brilliant, I'd only add that their designs don't just stop with respect to Crimea. They're definitely after Odessa as well, which is a key shipping port for wheat and the like. In terms of your question, Don, in terms of the Donbass, Absolutely. I think if you can capitalize that, if you can make this a point where you can see how this war pays for itself, because Donald Trump, better or worse, is someone that tends to see things through, a business lens. I don't want to say an economic lens. I don't think he thinks in terms of economics, but I think he views it as a business deal, if you will. Certainly, if he can see a way of the U.S. benefiting from that, that may be the best thing. Now, personally, I think that's crass. I don't think a country that is fighting for its survival, for liberty, indeed, in my opinion, for all of Western liberty, should have to be looking at the economics of it all and how they pay for it. But that may be a good route into getting into into Trump's mind. Time will tell.
Certainly. And gentlemen, just before we go, Professor, your outlook for the upcoming Trump administration. Do you have an opinion, or are you still waiting to see exactly what pans out?
The short of it, I don't have a very clear idea. I have a hope, and that is, I think that Putin will demand too much from President Trump, and therefore Trump will react against Putin and act more, as General Kellogg has said recently, that, okay, then I will escalate. The Ukrainians are very grateful to Trump because he gave them javelins, which turned out to be very helpful against the tank invasion from the north in 2022. So the Ukrainians now try to think perhaps Trump will do something good for us. And this example of one of the members of the Ukrainian parliament belonging to President Zelensky's party, who's now nominate Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. It doesn't cost anything. This is, I think, was very clever. This is what Trump is really very fond of. His vanity is extraordinary, and he wants to be complimented. And this is one of the greatest compliments he can get.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Poland tried that to get permanent troops here in the country by offering Fort Trump. That didn't work, but let's hope the Nobel Peace Prize does. Now, Mark, your thoughts. Same question posed to you. Are you still on the fence? Do you think that what Professor said is very likely?
Yeah, I think anyone trying to predict Trump is going to come up wrong. The man is his own man. He's driven by ego. So it's whatever that ego happens to wake up that day with that's going to drive his decision making. I think Professor Östlund is completely correct to say that maybe the better angle at this point in time, before Trump takes office, is to basically look at what Putin is doing. And he said it perfectly earlier in this interview. Putin is not out to negotiate. He's out for Ukrainian capitulation. And I think we've got to be wary of that. And I'm hopeful. And again, I notice a lot of us that are in the media right now trying to make Ukraine's case for survival and the fight that they're doing on behalf of Western liberty. We're all kind of in this statement where we keep saying we're hopeful. But I'm hopeful that Trump gets that he realizes that Putin thinks he can play Trump for a fool, and that Trump gets it, that he realizes that this guy is out to fleece the West. He's out to fleece Ukraine. And even if he gets, quote unquote, one of Trump's good deals, it's not going to be long lasting, and you're not going to see peace in Eastern Europe. So in the meantime, absent what we know in terms of what Trump may or may not do, it's still incumbent upon Eastern Europe especially, but all of Europe, to keep building its defenses, to keep getting prepared, because I don't think Russia's going to stop. And I think the weight of this potentially could fall upon Europe itself to make sure that Putin doesn't go any further.
Certainly. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for your analysis. Appreciate having both of you on. Mark Toth, national security expert, and Anders Haslund, senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Always an honor. Thank you.
And also this week on an episode of the Joe Rogan Experience with Scott Storch, the famed podcaster who's well known for his rather anti-Ukrainian position, threw fuel on an already burning fire and insulted President Zelensky and the people of Ukraine, saying that he was scared that Vladimir Putin would use nuclear weapons against the United States. He has also called the war launched by Russia a proxy war sparked by the West. Joe Rogan was called out by Wladimir Klitschko and the former foreign minister Dmytro Kuleba. Both figures want a chance to set the record straight with Rogan on his show, but so far Rogan is not yet taking up the challenge. And now I'd like to welcome Bogdan Nahilo, editor-in-chief at the Kyiv Post. Hello, and thank you very much for joining me on Ukraine This Week.
My pleasure.
So Joe Rogan, I know he's been quite a polarizing figure in Ukraine. We've seen, of course, the responses to this. Just tell us, what do you think? What do you think Ukrainians want to see from Joe Rogan?
The less of him, the better. I think that's what they want to see. Look, he's a non-entity in Ukraine, had never been heard of until these statements of his were blown up in the press. But look, what he's saying is not, a lone voice crying in the wilderness. It's typical of many voices, particularly in the Trump camp, that have been saying this sort of thing for ages now. So partly it's worrying because it affects the American mindset, and it's also worrying because it essentially borrows from Russian narratives. And so at this stage, when we are hoping that Trump and his administration are trying to sort out a line, a new approach, as it were, that can bring some results, we don't want to hear this old deja vu, deja entendu messages that, it's all sort of the West is to blame, what's the point, America first, and let's forget about not only Ukraine, but Europe, essentially.
Right. Well, let's take a look real quick at this footage that we have from Joe Rogan and, of course, Mr. Klitschko.
Was saying, finally, see what their headline was about Zelensky about Biden giving Zelensky the ability to use long-range missiles. U.S. made long-range. It's not like nobody knows where they came from. It's not like nobody knows we've been funding this. It's a proxy war.
Joe Rogan, I listened to your latest podcast. I'm sending you this video to let you know that I disagree. You talk about these American weapons being sent to Ukraine, which you believe will lead to the Third World War. So, let me tell you that you're repeating Russian propaganda. Putin's Russia is in trouble, so they want to scare you and people like you. His war was supposed to last 3 days. It has lasted 3 years, thanks to the heroism and sacrifice of us Ukrainians. So you're using the only weapon that Putin really intends to use, propaganda. And this weapon really weakens our democracies. Putin's Russia wants to destroy Ukraine quietly. They want America to stay quiet, not great, but quiet. A great America is not an America that abandons countries that defend freedom with their lives. In short, you see, I have quite a few points of difference. If you invite me on your podcast, we could discuss them like free men.
Very well said by Mr. Klitschko there. Now, looking at Joe Rogan, listen, I think the guy is a decent guy. He's a funny guy. He brings up a lot of different issues. He's a proponent of free speech. But when it comes to his stance on Ukraine, I simply disagree with him. You'd think a person like Wladimir Klitschko, who was a fighter, Joe Rogan's a fighter, you'd think this could appeal to Joe Rogan to maybe open his mind up and listen to an alternate narrative. Why do you think that Joe Rogan is not entertaining this idea?
I think he realizes that he's said something fairly stupid and he's being caught out. Look, I had the privilege of interviewing on stage in front of 30,000 people Wladimir Klitschko at the Web Summit in Lisbon a year ago, where we talked about the war with Russia as a heavyweight boxing contest. And I asked him, in what round are we in? Fifth, sixth? Are we getting tired? Is the public beginning to back the other side? What is happening? And Volodymyr Klitschko, not Vladimir, as in Putin, he was very forthright and eloquent, and I think he would give this guy a good run for his money. I think the American public should show what a former boxer, but a very intelligent man can say on behalf of Ukraine. And if Joe Rogan had the guts to go ahead with this, or to invite Kuleba, as you've mentioned, he'd get a thrashing. And that's why I believe he's probably worried, scared.
Certainly. Well, now, Bogdan, I'd like to move on to this recent report about this state-owned facility in Belarus and prisoners of war being filtered through there, some cases sent to Russia, many cases of torture there. Still, a Belarusian dictator is still being let off the hook, even for his role, which Vladimir Putin has already been indicted for the kidnapping of Ukrainian children. Lukashenko had a hand in this, maybe a smaller hand than Vladimir Putin did. But I'd like to get your thoughts on why there is still no consequences for Mr. Lukashenko.
Look, I think it's a complicated story. This camp, filtration camp, presumably was active in the first stages of the war. But since then, as we know, at the beginning and since, Lukashenko has allowed his territory to be used as a staging area to attack Ukraine constantly, whether by air or by proxy, by other means. Let's recall that 5 years ago almost, coming close to 5 years ago, he lost the election. He has over 1,500, 1,600 political prisoners, some of whom we've not heard of for years, like Tikhanovskaya's husband, for example. And though he has been sanctioned by the West to a degree, what worries me, and I've written about it as the chief editor of the Kyiv Post directly addressing Zelensky, is why has the Ukrainian government and the administration not taken a firmer stance against Lukashenko? Now, there are those who say, well, behind the scenes, they've got deals. Lukashenko will never allow his territory and his army to be used against Ukraine, which I think is rubbish, because maybe the army won't go. That's another reason. But he is using his territory, and he has bragged about deploying tactical nuclear warheads, which he doesn't control, which Moscow does on his territory. And, he blows hot and cold to try and lessen sanctions to get some sort of sympathy from the West that he's caught in between. But at the end of the day, he's a vassal of Moscow. And there's no excuse for Zelensky and his team to keep pretending that they can somehow diplomatically, behind the scenes, if you want, also do business. Tikhanovskaya, the leader of the Belarusian opposition, has been invited to the White House. She's invited constantly by the leaders of the West, whether it's Macron or Scholz or anybody. He's never invited her to Kyiv. And that worries me, because what is going on? Ukraine at this stage should be appealing to the Belarusians and saying, we are brothers in arms, we are brothers and sisters. It's a common battle against Russian imperialism, against despotism. Allies are the Poles, the Balts, the democratic world beyond, and we are your brothers and sisters. We stand by you. And it's a bad message to remain silent about this.
It is a bad message, but Ukraine does share a very long border with Belarus and probably just does not want another country joining in this war. Therefore, they have this stance.
But that's assuming that Belarus is capable of entering the war. Yes, they could be, shall we say, encouraged to do so by Moscow. But whether the average Belarusian soldier or even middle-rank officer is prepared to do so is another question. Look, until the war broke out, there's no secret that Ukraine was getting most of its diesel via Belarus via Mosir because it didn't have the capacity, the capabilities of making it itself. A residue from the Soviet period, but something that the previous governments had neglected to do. I'm talking about, Poroshenko's patriotic government and others. So I think that there was a reason between 2014 and 2022 to kind of stay on, not on the good side of Lukashenko, but not to bait him, not to provoke him. But there's no excuse whatsoever during the last 3 years to continue in the way that Kyiv has. And it's to the credit of certain deputies, an interfactional body within the parliament that has saluted the Belarusian people on its heroism and has called on the government and on the president to take a firmer stance and to distance themselves from official Minsk and to condemn it.
Well, that's a great point. And do you think within Belarusian society, if they were to become a party to the war, could that hasten the demise of Lukashenko based on the popular outlash that there would be?
In theory, yes. But I think that the brave Belarusian people took such a pounding from the goons that Lukashenko released against them. And let's remember that many of them were probably Russians in their masks, sent in just as in Ukraine and in Donbass and other areas. Russians from neighboring areas were brought in, were bussed in to do the policing business, the horrible business. Probably, I think that at this stage, the wounds of that unsuccessful national would-be revolution, the red and white one, are still so painful that people wouldn't rise up. But eventually, this will not be forgotten, and Lukashenko will be cursed by his own people, apart from those privileged circles that have made careers and have made fortunes out of this.
Okay, well, Bogdan Nahilo, editor-in-chief at the Kyiv Post, thank you very much for joining me today and talking about this. And I'll be waiting for someone from Ukraine to hopefully join Joe Rogan on his podcast to set the record straight. Maybe you should go.
No, I think Klitschko,
I think
good
he'd do it.
Right hand and a good left hand follow through would be just what's needed. A wake up call.
Certainly. Well, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And that's all on this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for another summary of all the latest events from the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.